Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Raising Healthy Mothers. We are in the very final week of school before school holidays start, and I am looking forward to it, I think, mostly for summer holidays, for those slower mornings, for not having to get anywhere, for not having to make packed lunches, and just being able to take things a little bit slower. I am nervous about having to be with the kids all on my own for a vast majority of summer holidays, but we'll get through it. We'll go outside lots, we'll spend lots of time with family and friends as well. So I hope summer's going to be a refreshing break for you, not a stressful one. Today, though, I wanted to talk about systems that I have started to implement that have made things a lot easier for me. And this is actually something that I posted on Instagram and it went kind of wild. Like, people loved it. There were so many saves on it. And I thought, hey, you know what? It warrants a longer dive into it in a podcast episode. So I hope you find this really useful. So I always say it took until my second child was 18 months old before I started feeling like life was starting to make sense, where I started feeling like tidying up and keeping the house clean was kind of not an insurmountable task anymore. Having said that, my youngest is sort of 3 3/4 now, and I'd say it's only really in the last 6 months or so where things make sense. Sleep has obviously got a lot better, so my sleep has got better, and just generally feel like I'm not completely drowning all the time. So I wanted to share these small systems that have made a big difference for me over time. They weren't really intentionally set up, they just sort of grew out of necessity. They grew out of just realizing, and I guess trial and error as well, of what needed to get done. And I particularly wanted to talk in this episode about the evenings, because I think that was when I used to find them particularly tricky. Like, come 5 o'clock, I'd look in the fridge and I'd have absolutely no idea what to cook for a start. Obviously, they were hungry. They were starting to get a bit bored. They were clinging on to me, and I was by that point really touched out and tired and just had enough of making decisions as well. And so evenings were just never great for me. I always felt like I was on the back foot. I always felt that I was spending way too long cooking. The kitchen was an absolute disaster. And everyone was hungry and grumpy. And I just felt so overwhelmed. And I would get really snappy. And I would just find the evenings were not chilled. And then, of course, then they'd have their dinner. They'd have their bath. They'd get to bed. And then we had to clean up. Like, it was just so exhausting, and it felt so never ending. And then you'd cleaned up, you'd sort of tidied up the house, and you're like, well, right, time for bed. So, I get it. I totally get that overwhelm of managing the house, the kids, and everything else. If you're working full time or even part time, like I am, like, it is a lot, and it's easy to feel like you're just constantly juggling. And that's where these systems came from. Like I said, I didn't intentionally sit down and go, right, I need to get organized. Like, I had read and heard and listened to all of the tips about how to be more efficient as a mom. And honestly, it just kind of made me overwhelmed, because I just thought I could never do this. But I did, step by step, slowly start putting systems in place that made a big difference. So I thought I would break it down in this episode, just so you know what I think has made the biggest difference to our evenings, and maybe hopefully you can take some inspiration from it as well. So the first thing I do is I get in the kitchen at 5 o'clock. I have come to realize that dinner has to be ready by 6 o'clock. Now, I know everyone's different families are very different, and everyone has different timings, different responsibilities, different activities, different work times. I know all of that, but for me, for my family, we need to be sitting down at around about 6 o'clock. I mean, in my head I always think somewhere between 6 and 6:30, but really, for the best kind of scenario, it has to be at 6 o'clock. And that is because we all sit down to eat together as often as possible. I mean, there are sometimes one meal or so a week where the kids might eat something super quick, maybe because I'm not hungry, maybe because we're just too busy, or we just fancy having a dinner where it's just the two of us, me and my husband, for a change. But for the most part, we eat together as a family, and we eat family style, which means I put all the plates out on the table and people get to choose what they want to eat. So I have to get in the kitchen by 5 o'clock for that to happen. And that's really important because I like to allow myself an hour to get dinner ready. Now, that doesn't mean I am cooking for a whole hour. For the most part, I like to keep my cooking to under half an hour, which is why all of my recipes in everything that I've ever produced, really, in my seasonal resets, in my dinner on the table guide, and as far as possible in my weekly table meal plans, I keep them to under half an hour. Now, that's not always strictly possible because sometimes there are meals that take longer, of course, but I try and do it in such a way that, you can cook it in the slow cooker so that your prep, actual time getting dinner ready is fairly minimal. Okay, so I've diverged a little bit, but anyway, I like to be in the kitchen by 5 o'clock, giving myself an hour to get things ready. Now, that sounds like a long time, but I do like to see this as time where I can just take things a little bit slowly and do things my way. Now, we have just started reintroducing screen time at 5 o'clock again for my kids. We had a very, very long break where they didn't watch any TV, didn't have any screen time at all. We recently reintroduced it where they just watch half an hour or so, and then after that they play, and then they come and help me get dinner or get dinner on the table. Anyway, I'm digressing and I'm getting ahead of myself. But the first thing I do is I get in the kitchen at 5 o'clock and I clear up. So obviously, ideally, we would be washing up our plates or whatever as we go through the day. Of course, that doesn't really happen. Like, we all know this, right? So the kitchen, more often than not, does need a bit of tidying up. Now, the other system that is starting to get into place is that we are starting to try and keep the kitchen a little bit more tidy and organized over, across the day. But for the most part, around about 5 o'clock, the first thing I do is I clear up the kitchen. I make sure the sink is clear so there's no washing up to do. If the dish draining rack is completely full, we don't have a dishwasher, so we have to air dry everything. So if the dish rack is full, then I will put things away so that I've got a clear rack ready for all the washing up that's going to happen over the next hour and a half. But I clear the kitchen, I wipe it down, and I just make it feel like a calm, clear space to start cooking. This usually takes me around 10 minutes. It's not that long. I do have quite a small kitchen. I try to keep it relatively clear across the day so that it doesn't take me that long to do that. It's a very small thing, but it really helps to prevent that frustration of trying to cook around clutter. Like I said, I have a small kitchen, which means I don't have a lot of space, a lot of surfaces to actually cook on. And if it is full of dishes and full of, stuff stuck on cereal from breakfast, it just makes me frustrated. And it also means that when I have a clear kitchen, I know where everything is. So any equipment that I need to cook, I don't have to go hunting for it. I don't have to wash it up specifically for that one task because I've already either washed it up or it's already been put away. Really helps to keep my head clear while I'm cooking. It makes me feel so much more in control rather than overwhelmed by cluttered surfaces in a kitchen that just makes me feel so anxious. So that's the first thing I do. And then I cook dinner. And as I said, I try and keep that to around about half an hour. And then once dinner is ready, by that point, the children have finished their screen time that they've been watching while I cook dinner. They are expected to come and help set the table. And while they do that, before we sit down to eat, I spend 5 minutes washing up again. Now, of course, if we've been cooking, we have generated more washing up to do. It's inevitable, isn't it? So I like to serve my food on nice serving platters rather than out of the, saucepans or dishes or whatever. I mean, it's partly an aesthetic thing. I just like putting things in pretty dishes, but also I like being able to wash up the pans and all of the slightly more difficult washing up. I like to wash that up before we sit down for dinner. And so it usually only takes around about 5 minutes to do another clear up. Like I said, I've already cleared up from before I started cooking. So it's just whatever I've used during cooking. And that's usually like a chopping board, a knife, any bowls that I've used for marinating or mixing, and of course, any pots of pans that I might have used in the cooking. So I do that. And while I do that, the children and my husband together are expected to set the table. And I think this works quite well because, as I said, they've usually been having screen time at that point. They might have stopped and, gone off to play while I finish up. But in general, they've finished their screen time. And I don't know if you've noticed, but if you have your children watching TV and then you try and get them to sit down for dinner straight away, they really push back. And this was something I learned when I talked to Alexis Ralphs in an episode from last year about kind of screen time and toys and all of these things. And he said about how it is a really tricky transition from that kind of almost zombie state of watching screens to then the sort of parental expectation of sitting down and eating their meal. They actually need to move their body, to be active, to use their brains again, having sort of sat down and been fairly sedentary while watching TV. So having that kind of little bit of transition between, okay, the TV's going off now, to we're sitting down to dinner, I think can really help them and me not have that frustration. So they might, if their TV time has finished before I'm actually ready to get dinner out, then they might play for a little bit. But ideally, they finish their screen time, then they come into the kitchen and help set the table. Now, my children are 6 and 3, so they are still, really learning about how to do these things. So, of course, my husband supports them where possible. But, that is the expectation. So having this routine of I've finished cooking, I'm going to clear up the kitchen again, and everyone else sets the table, helps to share the load. It helps to kind of understand that meals don't just appear on the table, they take effort. So I have just been cooking and it's their responsibility to get it out on the table. And sometimes I do literally finish cooking, I do my washing up, and I'll just sit down and wait for everyone to notice that the food hasn't actually arrived on the table. Why? Because I'm not the magic cooking fairy and there is stuff to do. So it really helps. Once I've done that clearing up, it means that it completely reduces the total clearing up time after dinner. So we've got more time to play and so on. But once I've cleared up the kitchen, it helps me to know that I can focus on enjoying the meal, knowing that the only clearing up after this is just washing up the dishes. So our dinner table actually isn't in the kitchen, it's in a separate room. But I imagine that if it was in the kitchen and the kitchen was looking like a bit of a tip after cooking and all the pots and pans everywhere, it would feel like visually quite stressful because I would see what still needs to be done. Now, I have become a much more streamlined cook and a much more, less chaotic cook than I used to be. It used to be literally the kitchen has exploded and it's pots and pans everywhere. I'm much, much better now as I've got more streamlined in my cooking. But still, I know that if I didn't clear up immediately before we sit down to eat, it would be like very stressful knowing that that's still to come. And as I said, while I'm washing up, the children and my husband are setting the table. And then we sit down for dinner. And as I said, we try and make that a family experience. We all sit down together. We all eat roughly the same food, not always, and I usually accommodate them to a certain extent, but for the most part I cook the meals that I want to eat and I make sure there are elements that they are going to be happy to eat as well. And if you need a little bit of help with that, if you're not sure what that looks like, then almost every meal on the weekly table meal plan that I share every Friday, I do add a little fussy eater tip there, so that I say, look, if you do have a fussy eater and you know they're not going to like this meal, here are some ideas to serve it in a way that might be a bit more acceptable to them. Anyway, so we eat together as a family. And then once we've finished eating dinner, this is the most important thing I think that I do, is that I let the children clear the table. Now, again, they are 6 and 3. They're still learning how to do this safely. So obviously we do give them a lot of support. But I generally tend to sit at the table and hand them the dishes and everything, the cutlery, the glasses, or whatever needs to be cleared up. And my husband will stand in the kitchen and receive them. Now, they've been doing this for almost a year now, and I have noticed things have changed. So obviously my son has got bigger and stronger, so he's able to carry heavier things, but he also knows what to do with them now. So whereas it used to be that he would just hand them over to my husband to put somewhere safe, he now knows that he's got to stack them up by the sink. And it's a really great way to see how, my ideal, of course, is that the children clear the table and they wash up and I don't have to do anything after dinner, because that's how I grew up, right? But I did that when I was a teenager. So there must have been a lot of scaffolding that went on beforehand. And that's what I'm scaffolding now for my children. I'm teaching them that we clear the table once dinner is over. We don't just kind of leave that to the washing up fairies to do. We do all work together. And I do think this is such an important way to teach responsibility. Give them a sense of contribution, like, food doesn't just appear and get cleared away. There is something that we have to do collectively. I do talk about being on a team, and that being part of the team means that we have to help each other out. And I think it's really important not to fall into the trap of, I'll do it myself. Look, I do that sometimes. Okay, sometimes for whatever reason, maybe we're late, maybe dinner was a little bit later, but this is all part of the reason why I've got to get dinner on the table by 6 o'clock, which means I have to start cooking by about 5 o'clock. But, as much as possible, I just want to avoid that resentment of I do everything and no one notices, okay? So when you share the load, obviously we feel a lot more connected as well, because, we realize that we're a family, we're a team, and that there are some things that we have to do that may not be the funnest thing to do, but we need doing before we can move on to the funner things. Now, of course, I do try and make it a bit of fun if I can, make it into a bit of a game. As long as they can carry things safely, then there's no reason not to. And then the next thing, the final thing that I do that makes evenings go so much easier and just feel less stressful is that I do clean the kitchen immediately, or rather my husband and I take it in turns, or whoever just makes more sense to do this. Okay, this is not something I always do. I do it as often as possible, and I'd say we do it 5 nights out of 7. But if for whatever reason dinner has been delayed, or I'm on my own, if I'm on my own and dinner has been a little bit later than I would have liked, then perhaps I might leave it until after they've gone to bed. But ideally, we will clear up as soon as dinner has finished. And this is something that I did growing up. Once dinner finishes, you have to clear up. And I do think this is a really important thing, because for me, clearing up after dinner is all part of the eating dinner thing, right? So if dinner has finished early enough, then the children might go and, once they finish clearing up the table, then they might go and play, usually with my husband, because he might have been at work all day, and I actually quite frankly need that bit of time away from them. And so while they're playing, then I'm going to be clearing up. If they need to have a bath, or for whatever reason they need to go straight up to bed, then whichever parent is doing bedtime that night, the other parent is clearing up the kitchen immediately. It took ages for this to happen, okay? So don't feel like this is something that I've always done. Like, it has only been a thing in the last, 6 months, maybe a year, where we have got into this fairly clear routine. Because it used to be just so much easier to leave the washing up for later. And it was usually because I never managed to get dinner on the table at 6 o'clock. Like I always wanted, I always aimed for that. But for whatever reason, I never quite managed it. Like, I don't know, dinner would often be more like 7 o'clock. And that meant that as soon as dinner finished, we had to get them up to bed, because it was, otherwise it would just be too late. And I just couldn't get into that routine of doing it in a way that was going to get them to bed earlier, basically, or to get dinner done, get the clearing up done. Anyway, so I did finally get into that routine, and I do believe the thing that made it happen was meal planning, knowing at 5 o'clock exactly what I'm going to cook that day, being able to get it out the fridge and just get started on it, rather than thinking, oh my goodness, I don't know what I'm going to make, I don't have all the ingredients, just that kind of indecision, that decision fatigue as well, of like, oh, I can't think to what to make for dinner again, was all gone when you started meal planning. Like, it made such a big difference, I feel, to know that I know what I'm going to be cooking at 5 o'clock, and then I could just get started as soon as the kitchen was clear. I know that once I've put the children to bed, once I've lain with them and I've read a book to them and I've, waited until they've fallen asleep, I'm really tired. Like, I just don't want to do anything. So the idea of having to go downstairs, knowing that there's going to be a pile of washing up, just is more exhausting. And quite often I used to just leave it to my husband to do and just be like, oh, I can't do it, I need to go to bed. And that wasn't much fun either, because ideally we want to spend our evenings together, right? So like I said, I realised that it starts with getting dinner ready on time, which means getting in the kitchen at 5 o'clock. And that means knowing exactly what I'm going to cook come 5 o'clock. And it makes such a difference if we are eating by 6 o'clock. It is so important for how the whole evening then goes, because it leaves time to clear up and have some playtime together and just have that moment of connection. Like I said, these systems have evolved over time, and they have taught me the importance, the value of setting up systems and routines, because they help maintain a healthy mental space and manage my energy. Like, it didn't happen overnight, and it is something that has happened slowly. And so I would really like to encourage you, if this inspires you, if you feel like this is something that you would love to start doing, start small. Like, choose one of them. Maybe you're like me, like I used to be constantly getting dinner like way too late. Well, maybe work back and think, okay, what time do I actually need to be in the kitchen getting dinner going so that I need to eat by a certain time? That was such a major thing for me, is knowing that, and also knowing that I'm going into the kitchen knowing what I'm going to cook makes such a difference. So start small, focus on just one habit, building one habit at a time, making that just the thing that you do. I know it's tempting to want everything to be perfect, to be, you might have listened to this and feel completely inspired and be like, right, I'm going to completely change the way we do things and just do it perfectly. But these are about progress. They're about what works for you. It's not about perfection. It's not about completely copying what I do. It's about getting inspiration and going, okay, what's the most important thing to start with? Like I said, for me, it was knowing that when I go into the kitchen at 5 o'clock, I know what I'm going to cook. And on those days when I don't know what to cook, that is when the system falls apart. That is when I know that I'm not going to get dinner ready quick enough so that we are, clearing up and playing and doing all those lovely things that we want to do before we actually get to bed. I remember looking at all these other mums who seem to have their stuff together so well, like they seem so sorted. And I realise now that actually it can often be a matter of priorities. What's important to me may not be important to others, but also knowing that there is a certain minimum threshold that allows me to feel calm in my own space. And for me, the kitchen is so important. I need the kitchen to be completely reset before we go to bed. And that's important to me. And like I mentioned a few times now, the starting point, the thing that really kind of moved the needle for me, that got things going, was planning my meals in advance. It made such a difference. And believe me when I say this is something I have dragged myself into kicking and screaming. I always used to say, but what if I don't want to eat that thing? What if I plan all of these meals and actually I don't want to do it? Well, obviously my number one thing is plan meals that you actually want to eat no matter what, but also just plan a flexible system, but because it is genuinely the thing that has made the biggest difference to my mental space. And it is why I created the weekly table, the meal planning system that I share over on Substack. Every Friday morning, I share the meals that work best for me, that I've either cooked in the previous week so that I know I'm going to be coming up in the next weeks. It uses the meal planning system that has meant dinner time has gone from the most stressful time of day to one of the easiest. The meals that I put in there are designed for you. They're designed for me. They're designed for you, the busy mums who just feel like they don't have time, they don't have the energy, and they don't have the mental space to kind of think, and who have found themselves in that cooking rut of, I don't know what to cook for dinner anymore. But they are also flexible to work for real life. They are not a Pinterest perfect ideal meal plan that you should be eating. It's about what works for you in your current season of life. I would love to help make meal planning one less thing to worry about, with the hope that you can then walk into your kitchen every day at 5 o'clock knowing exactly what you're going to make that day, so that dinner can be on the table at the time when you need it to be, so that your evenings can go as smoothly as possible within the boundaries of what we know little people can be like when it comes to bedtime. So I'd love to give you that gift of simplicity. When you subscribe to the weekly table, you get a meal plan straight to your inbox with all the recipes, plus the fussy eating tips and bonus snacks or recipes that I know are going to make you feel good about yourself. So if you love the idea of having all your meals planned for you by a nutritional therapist and trained natural chef, then please subscribe to the weekly table. The link is in the show notes, or you can head over to tashadecruz.substack.com and you can subscribe from there. I hope this episode has helped you to think about ways to make your evenings work better for you, and hopefully inspire you to make a little change, just one small change. Remember that it's just going to make things feel a lot less stressful come dinner time. Next week is our very final episode of this season of Raising Healthy Mothers, and then we're off for the whole of August on a summer break. I hope to see you again next week, and if not, I hope you have a really great summer, and I'll see you again in September. Bye for now.